Good afternoon, everyone. I keep wanting to say good morning today. I don't know why that is. I think either I didn't get enough sleep last night or I haven't had enough coffee, and I'm really not sure which one it is today, but it's definitely. Um, Today we are joined, in fact, our last Careers Week talk, we are joined uh, by sorry, I'm about to get this right. Jamie Stewart, sorry, Jamie, from Sports Interactive, who's going to be talking to us today about it's okay not knowing now. And I think that this is going to be an interesting talk about coming into the industry and people feeling that they have to know everything when they come in. I hope that's the direction of the talk anyway. Um, I'm not going to be introducing Jamie any further than that because I think there's probably the best person to introduce Jamie is Jamie himself. So without further ado, I will hand over. Apart from saying that, the little bit of further ado is if you have any questions throughout this, I will be moderating the chat. So please drop your questions in chat. And Jamie has said that he's willing to take questions throughout. So if you have any, please do let us know. So that was a little bit of ado before the without further ado. Jamie, apologies for that. So yeah, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your talk, please.
Yeah, no problem. So what I'll do is I'll start sharing my screen because I've got introductory slides, which is half the fun. So hopefully this is all come up and it is sharing. Everyone can see that, hopefully, yeah?
Perfect.
Okay, so not knowing's half the fun. I toyed with the title for this one for a while, and I was trying to find some sort of appropriate football pun to fit in, but I couldn't quite get there. And I'm usually quite good with those. But this is me. My role at Sports Interactive covers managing the onboarding and progression of software engineers. So I look at keeping engineers we have, developing their talents, as well as where's my notes? Sort of, yeah, developing their talents as well as bringing new talent in. And there's developers at Sports Interactive who've been there since day one. And that's not just the Collier brothers, although they're both still here. About 20% of the Sports Interactive team have been here for more than 10 years.
Wow.
And again, I'll start with the sort of the nice one is that's actually not me. That's a Photoshop of me. Used to hang on the walls at a certain university that I worked at, and no one noticed for a good, well, forever, because I don't work there anymore. And no one said anything when I was there. And I love it. And this thing's followed me around for at least 10 years. So I'm 10 years older, but none the wiser from that photo. But a cover, for those of you that don't know, what is Football Manager? Football Manager is what we work on at Sports Interactive. It's a football management simulation. So unlike, FIFA or PES, it's not a football action arcade game. You take on the role of a manager of a football team, any team out of the 2,500 clubs spread across 51 nations that we have,
Wow.
and you get to dictate, how you play the game, how your team is trained, etc. You get to do other fun things like recruit backroom staff, find out if you need to have a new physio or head of sports science, how much budget do you or don't you have for transferring players in, or you can join a team and sell all of their players, which is half the fun. Um, Not that I ever do that when I play, but you get complete control of this sort of stunningly realistic game world. And you can manage this team anywhere as well. We ship on all platforms. So you have PC, console, phone, uh, tablet, Apple Arcade, Xbox, etc. We're on all of them. And it
For
began
me, it's
life as a bedroom game way back in the. Sorry?
I've spent so many hundreds and hundreds of hours on this. I've never gone to the mobile version because I think that was the bit for me where it's like if I went mobile as well, I don't know. I don't know if I'd ever get anything done. And the chat's just going now. It's like some people have, their last interaction with Football Manager was 2012, and other people are saying I play it literally every day of every week. It's quite addictive.
Yeah, we get a fantastic crowd. I like the sort of when you make games for long enough, you'll get a handle on like who plays our game. Um, and FM it is literally anybody and anyone, and it's
Yep.
everybody's sort of guilty pleasure as well. There's so many people, tell me like, oh, I don't play games, but I play that. Is it a game? It is a game. It's a way of life.
Uh,
But yeah, Sports Interactive, we sort of Championship Manager first turned up in Manager. Sports Interactive was then founded in 1994, so we released the game before we were a company, and then sort of split with the original publishers to work with Sega in 2003, and then Sports Interactive was sort of bought by Sega in 2006, so we're a Sega company. This is the sort of story so far, the stats so far for this year. Yes, we're a multi-award-winning series, and we've got a really awesome interactive fan base as well. But Football Manager 2023 has done really well this year. We've had over 5.8 million players, and this is about a week old, so this is already out of date because I know the actual numbers. But obviously our comms department like to keep a hold of that. Although I can say matches played is now over 1 billion because my boss Miles tweeted about that last week. So people have played over 1 billion football matches in FM23, scored a lot of goals. There's been a lot of sackings as well, which I can probably say I made up 322 of because I'm quite good at getting made redundant. But it's more than a game. It's frequently referenced by football media, which is cool. We make a game that's a simulation of the football world, yet the football world actually uses our data, and our graphics continue. Like I think it was last year, or maybe it was 21, for the K League, the Korean League. Some of the sporting channels over there were using Football Manager UI to compare players side by side with
wow.
our player attribute values and stuff. So it's really weird that it feeds into itself this way. And now clubs like recently Wayne Rooney sort of announced on, I can't remember, Forbes, I think it was, he was talking about managing FC Dallas and how they have access to games. And it's kind of nuts. Real players and managers sort of discuss their love for the game. It's been the focus of a feature-length documentary, numerous books, a stand-up comedy show, which is a feat for any video game. And we've got long-standing partnerships with like Watford Football Club, AFC Wimbledon, and a host of others. Brighton. We've got some sponsorship with them, or partnership with them, I should say. Who else do we currently have a partnership deal with? Everton Women's Football Club as well as League Managers Association, anti-discrimination charity Kick It Out. We're heavily involved with War Child and other, charitable things as well. So there's a lot of ground that Football Manager covers. But in this talk, this is a bit different for me because usually I do something very tech focused. And this one's a bit different because I was told to talk about myself for 20 minutes. And I mean, I have insider information on that, but it's not something I generally do. And I think I can talk about me for most of this talk and still cover what it's like to not know everything because I'm really good at not knowing everything. And that's perfectly okay as a software engineer. But how did I get to here? This is an interesting one. So I started out writing application software before getting into game development. I'd previously gone to uni for an IT degree after getting out of the Australian Army, which was something that I, as a impressionable youth, got myself talked into. We don't have like sort of conscription or anything daft like that anymore, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. And yeah, I undertook a games programming qualification, sort of not at university level, more like like an advanced diploma, sort of like a DIP HE over here, I think. But I'd been in a job in the army where I was told what to think, and I kind of don't want to change that to learn how to think. That's my sort of whole approach with this one. So my first job in the games was working for 2K, 2K Sports. I worked at Venom Games on titles like Don King's Prize Fighter, and yeah, boxing games. And it was coming into the studio. We also used to port games as well. So we had things like porting the original Prey to Xbox 360, the original BioShock to PS3. So yeah, even though I'd studied game dev, and I passed the entrance test for 2K at the time, I had some new control working on large team built games. I'd only ever really done sort of small individual sort of programming projects, maybe a little bit with the application software. I'd done something in a team, but again, it was all very small stuff.
It's quite interesting
I had
because
no idea what a coding standard was, so I had to brush up on that. Mm.
2K now still have a really good sort of onboarding and junior programming onboarding channel as well, don't they? I think that they, I think that's a, if someone's looking to get into the industry, how did you find that? One of the questions here is how did you find your sort of first onboarding challenge and going through that process? How was that for you?
I think what onboarding would have, been the thing at the time. It was sort of I was thrust into it. This was 2006,
Right.
2005. There was no sort of onboarding process. I was kind of thrown into it, going, we want you to work on some mini games for Prizefighter. Here's a scripting language called Lua that we're using. Uh, Here you go. And I didn't even get given a textbook on Lua. It was a case of just like, read this, you'll figure it out.
Right.
So yeah, I had to look like, what the hell's Lua? What the hell's a scripting language? There was none of this, the stuff that maybe juniors would take for granted a little bit now. There was no onboarding process. It was sort of like sink or swim, I guess. So yeah, it was really fun. Actually, the first mini game I worked on was great because I spent like 3 months working on this. It was a Don King's Prize Fighter, so it's a boxing game. You take on the role of a boxer. Had a bit of a documentary behind it, sort of docu feel. But yeah, part of it was they wanted to have a girlfriend dating mini game in there. And I thought this is the worst idea ever for a boxing game. And yeah, it proved to be right because after 3 months, they basically said, yeah, we're going to scrap that idea and we're going to get you to work on something else. So the 3 months worth of work that I'd done was just thrown out. But I was really happy because I always sort of thought that was a terrible idea for a mini game. But yeah, that was my introduction to 2K. It was a very sort of sink or swim thing, and I had a lot to sort of get to grips with. Sadly, like Venom Games closed down as a studio after releasing Prizefighter, and I moved on to work at a nearby games company called Eutechnics, who worked on racing games and simulations. And this 2K wouldn't be my first redundancy in the industry. It wouldn't be my last anyway. So I got to work on racing games and simulations, and there was some other games which I'm not going to mention that Eutechnics worked on too, because working on them was kind of felt like what the game was titled. But yeah, I had to learn a new programming language again. Eutechnics use Python as a scripting language, so I had to do like mission scripting and things like that in Python, and also for their online racing game, was it ACR Revolution, Auto Club Revolution? Yeah, that used Python on the back end. Used a version of Python called Stack. I have the Python 2.5 textbook somewhere. I could obviously get it out and use it to prop up my monitor even further because I don't think it's got much use left to it. But yeah, I was at Eutechnics for a while, picking up new stuff yet again. Then the iPhone happened. So after a while at Eutechnics, the iPhone launched. And in my sort of free time, I'd been making flash games on Nokia phones with a friend of mine as a bit of a hobby. We decided to jump on the Apple train and try that. So I moved out of Eutechnics and started making iPhone games. And again, new development language. I had to get used to Objective-C, which is kind of like square brackets in all the wrong places. And yeah, I actually needed to, the funny one here I was thinking about was I actually needed to learn how to turn on a Mac first. Because I started with my first ever sort of Apple experience was on a Hackintosh Dell that I had. And then we, got an iMac when we were going to do it properly. And I had to try and figure out where the power button was on an iMac, which was amusing for my, mate Stu. But thankfully, C++ was also an option on this, so I had a lot of, Objective-C wrappers around C++, etc. So I could kind of get by with that and didn't need to learn too much until we started doing some just application or iOS apps instead of iOS games, and then I had to use the Objective-C layers for animations and things like that. The other thing I had to learn in this one was like product delivery as well, like actually uploading a game to the App Store. That had been, previously I'd been like a small cog in a bigger machine, and now I was like one of two cogs in a very tiny machine. So I had to, figure out this new stuff as I went. Then I sort of, after a few years of being an indie dev, my old uni actually called up and said, hey, do you want to try lecturing?
Wow.
And I thought, yeah, why not? So I relocated to Australia and took up teaching games dev at uni. Well, I relocated back to Australia, I should say. Um, yes, time I'd been writing apps for BlackBerry Playbook, and that made me want to do anything else but write more apps for BlackBerry Playbook. So BlackBerry had like a weird version of, again, another development language, Java, which we got into from doing iOS stuff into Java, but BlackBerry had like branched Java before some really useful stuff came in. So they had like their own version of various libraries instead of the standard Java ones, which was a right pain to work with. But yeah, I had to learn new stuff. I had to learn how, course creation, how is a course created? What's the accreditation process for it? Is there an accrediting body that goes through and, approves what's being taught? So I had to learn all that sort of stuff. Then I moved to the Netherlands to take up lecturing over there for some more opportunities that had arisen. I nearly learnt a new language again, but this time it's a spoken language. All I can say is the Dutch are far better at English than I am. It was a fun experience. Most of them speak far better English than I do, and asking if they could, because my son was going through the school system there very early on, and asking my neighbor, like, can you speak Dutch to me so I can pick some up? And her response just being, you won't, you're bad at Dutch. And I was like, okay, thanks. Very blunt, very great, very fun. I did the Aussie thing. I learned, how to ask for a beer, which proved to be difficult because they have variations on the word the. And also, it's not unlike French and Spanish, etc., it's not a masculine, feminine language, although it is. Because you've either got, het or det, the two variations of the, and it depends on just what you're asking for. Fascinating language. But yeah, after that, I relocated to the UK again to lecture at university over here on games programming. And that was cool. I had no new languages. This is about the first and only time I've moved to a job and not had something entirely new to learn. So that was like the only experience of like not having to brush up on stuff, although I did have to brush up on a few things. I only had to learn new things throughout my career. I've now moved back to industry, working at Sports Interactive, and sort of there are new things to learn here as well. I've learned how to turn on a Mac since then with that. And I think there's a point where people assume you need to know everything. And I'm comfortable with real. Sometimes it's long enough that I've forgotten stuff, and I've gone into each new role not knowing everything. But I'm sort of aware of that, and perhaps that helps with imposter syndrome from time to time. I've certainly experienced that, particularly when I was teaching in the Netherlands, because a lot of the people that I worked with were, other former games developers that, I'd sort of really been influenced by their work. A couple of them were like, I've played your games, and really exciting. And then I'm like, why am I here when these guys have done really cool stuff? But yeah, there's this, I keep constantly reminded of this conversation I heard two students having, and this was about matrix math. And one of them was like, it's okay, one day it'll just click and we'll get it. And I was like, that's not how it works. I was younger, we'd be taught something and you just know it. Like everything was delivered and it was some sort of like closed problem, with like a limited set of knowledge. And after school, getting shouted at in the army, I was kind of over being told what to think, and I really wanted to explore that, how to think, and that's what got me into university. And I still read articles with this sort of stuff in, where like, you see like, what has university offered me? And the byline is usually that those writing the articles I sometimes think they've missed the point. Like teachers aren't there to spoon knowledge into people. They're like facilitators for getting you to understand how you can learn as well. But like learning takes effort and it's like a hard thing. Plus, I've never been able to struggle with. But yeah, a lot of it is really just repetition and going over things again and again and doing it wrong enough times to get it right. But like knowing everything, I've always found like I've never met a software engineer who says they know everything. And if I did, I don't think they'd be a very good engineer. There's like so much content out there that knowing everything is impossible. Everything is kidding themselves. Even having complete mastery of just one language, like knowing all of C++, I think is virtually impossible. There is that much going on, updates and changes to the language that, getting that I keep seeing is this idea of a T-shaped engineer versus a 10x engineer. Um, and 10x engineers are like unicorns. They're mythical things that don't exist. Um, it's something I hadn't heard about until I was like in my 5th or 6th year of lecturing, and then someone mentioned like, oh, they're a 10x engineer, and I was like, I don't even know what that is. They're an engineer at the same level. They write incredible faultless code, and they just elevate the team by existing. And like, it's not very often someone can lead and manage a team while writing amazing code at the same time. Leading a team involves typically people management skills that, sometimes lie outside the realm of technical engineering skills. And it's not impossible to do both, but it's certainly pretty uncommon to do both.
Agreed.
And it's someone that has like a breadth of knowledge, and having a breadth of knowledge is good, but they only have deep knowledge in one or two specific areas. And it's a much more realistic view of what I'd say a good engineer is. It's like, some areas are complementary to each other, like a rendering code and compression techniques go well together. So you can usually have quite a bit of depth of knowledge on maybe those two things. Bit packing into textures and stuff kind of reflects on some of the things we do with, deferred rendering and trying to take up as little space as possible. So yeah, I think the T-shaped description is quite good, knowing that you've got this breadth of knowledge, but not a depth of knowledge, not in all areas. And the T-shaped engineer doesn't know all the answers. So game development covers so many genres, and knowing everything's virtually impossible. And that's not just across disciplines of like art, code, and design. Different games require different knowledge sets. And like a gameplay engineer at Sports Interactive doesn't need to use a lot of 3D Maths Daily. The Match Engine team use 3D Maths Daily. They're the guys that write the simulation side of it. The gameplay side is a little bit different. That's the narrative and the dialogue and the options that go on during the game. Match team, on the other inverse of that, doesn't need to know a lot about branching narratives. They're more involved with 3D mathematics and that side of things and distribution. So they've got, in-depth knowledge there, maybe some knowledge of the other thing, but they don't know everything, and nor would I expect them to. And it's, you can know the language, but you don't have to retain all knowledge of the language. I frequently have to remind myself, like I know enough similar languages of like Java, C++, C# that I have occasionally Googled recently how to write a class in each one of those. As I switch between languages, I'll be like, okay, is it public class, then the name of the class, or is it just class, name of the class? Like I will forget if I've been in one or the other for a while, like if I'm moving from C# to C++. And, I will have to look it up. I'll Google it, or I'll just code it wrong, and then the compiler will tell me that something's wrong, and then I'll look it up or realize what I've done. And it's just that repetition of going through it. I couldn't list what is, all of the undefined behaviors or undefined, or how to get undefined behavior in C++. I know a few of them because I've done it enough times to be told that that's, it, or, simple things that I've done. I know enough Python too, but how much has changed from 2.7 to version 3? Do I need any of that? Can I just get by with treating it the same as I've always treated it, or is there specific, things that have been deferred or depreciated since then? Is a language feature supported on the device is something I continually have to look up with C++ as well. At Sports Interactive, we're quite good with using very sort of modern C++ techniques. I think we're using C++ 17 across everything, with looking to adopt bits of C++ 20 as it comes in. But again, we have to look, because we ship on all platforms. Does every platform support this? With the case of some, Nintendo Switch hardware, etc., things like that, perhaps they don't support all the features of C++ 17, or they do now, or it's looking at that. But I know how to get the answers, I guess, is the thing. And you need to know where to look to find them. I myself use a lot of textbooks. And I think, finding the right textbook can be a right challenge. I like books on programming languages and not on programming tools. So not, I don't have books on like, Unity development or Unreal development or things like that. I have, books on languages and underlying, OpenGL, DirectX, etc. But tools advance quicker and change faster than the language does. Unity's gone through so many different iterations that a textbook from 4 years ago could pretty much be redundant now. So I'd never sort of invest in those. But if you look at things like, I can still write OpenGL 1.0 code and it will compile, because nothing, like, even though they tell you it's depreciated, you can still write it, which is half the trouble with a lot of the tutorial stuff out there, is geared for like older versions of a language, and trying to find out which is the current way of implementing that feature is a bit annoying. But yeah, realizing what a good textbook is and what works for you is a challenge. I mean, as a lecturer, you get inspection copies of books that you might adopt for your course, and I went through enough inspection copies of textbooks to sort of figure out which authors do I like, or which brand of book do I sort of gel with the best. For everything else, there's like, there's MSDN for Microsoft's developer documentation on everything, or the equivalent site for, like, if you go across to Apple and look at the Objective-C stuff over there, or the Metal language stuff over there as well. Sometimes you can find answers on Stack Overflow. I don't like Stack Overflow as the best reference, although it's getting close to peer reviewed at times. It's a bit opinionated though. So documentation is the other thing that I maintain, just so that I know where to look upon return. And with my documentation or code comments, it's not just a fact of like, oh, this is what it does. For in the past, I've done things like an implementation of something called salmon mapping, which was something I had to look up at the time to go through how does it work. And my code comment was just web links to the actual things that I'd read about salmon mapping, or I'll reference a textbook in a code comment, so that if I'm coming back to it or someone else is coming back to it or looking at it for the first time, they can at least find where my reference material was, so they can go like, oh, that was in this C++ or this C# textbook, and pull out a reference from there. But yeah, how did I learn what I know now? Like, I've retained more knowledge than when I was a junior engineer, and my sort of process for that is it's just repetition. I've always learned best from reading, and I use lots of bookmarks in browsers as well, just earmarking things for future to try and pick that back up. I've worked in enough rendering code and shaders to know that I'm probably going to need an edge detection kernel at some point in a game, be it for stylized rendering or highlighting an object in the distance, or mouse picking. And I know what the Sobel kernel looks like, but there's projects like Manifold Garden, and a couple of others like stylized things like that I have bookmarked, that I'll just go, okay, what was their edge detection algorithm, and was it better? Can I implement it? Do they have a developer blog? So yeah, typically I'll go back and I learn from doing. So I'll read something and then I'll implement what I've read, and then I'll go back and read it again to work out why my implementation didn't work, which is usually what happens, until I sort of get it right. And there's loads of like online video tutorial platforms as well. Like, if you don't learn well from reading, there's Udemy, Coursera, Code Academy is another sort of good thing to, push through. I think the difficulty with that I find, coming from someone who's created courses before, is that there's no accreditation on there. So it's hard to distinguish what makes a good course from an okay course. There's some on there where it's like, that's not how I teach that, or if you've been in industry for long enough, they might be teaching some poor practices. Like, you look at some of the online Unity stuff that gets taught or showcased around, and I'm always like, well, yeah, there's allocations in there though, or someone's creating a closure, and they're not talking about that as being a sort of problem of like, allocating a small fragment of memory every update, and then having the garbage collector come along and clean that up later on. But that's nitpicky, because again, at the end of the day, if you implement a game and it works for you and that's never a problem, then it's never a problem. But it depends on that depth of knowledge. If you're looking at, do I want to learn all about optimization techniques and making the most of, not invoking the wrath of the garbage collector, versus, gameplay techniques and gameplay code, and implementing, different probabilities and different distribution sort of things. I read a load of development blogs as well. I used to follow a lot of devs on Twitter, etc., and social media and things like that. Like alt dev blog a day was a thing. That was a long time ago now. Um, I used to love stuff like that. Twitter's getting harder to find, good content on amongst all the noise. And plus, obviously, it's not called Twitter anymore. It's called X, and everyone's left or hasn't left or is in the process of doing so. There's another platform called Mastodon, which had some promise, but it always reminds me of a metal band, and I never really quite got. But um, yeah, there's a lot of different stuff out there. There's GitHub repos as well. You can sometimes find a good curated list on GitHub of related sort of topics that are all grouped together, or GitHub repos that are all grouped together to look at. It's nice when people actually use their Markdown README files to sort of talk about what they've done. There's new tools like ChatGPT as well as a sort of it. Yes, it can help you write code, I suppose. I've done the opposite. I've made ChatGPT write documentation for my own code, um, purely to see if it could do that. Again, engineers and writing documentation is something we're all guilty of not doing from time to time. So if there's a tool I could use to do that for me, that'd be great. It was entertaining. It did mostly work depending on what sort of code you gave it. Sometimes it just made stuff up. Again, it's Sports Interactive. We don't make use of ChatGPT. Neither does Sega. It's something we're not sort of using. And again, that stems to like ownership of things and stuff like that. But it's an interesting tool to play with as far as learning or trying to get it to explain something in layman's terms to me so that I can understand it. Because I might read something and not get it, and then paste it into ChatGPT and ask, what is this on about? But like my role now is another one of like, I didn't plan to become a developer advocate. And, my career has been sort of one of not knowing everything and not really knowing what's next from time to time. But I've enjoyed sort of figuring out how to get these things done, going from like, doing to teaching back to doing again, although I still did while I taught. Um, and I've always tried to do well at whatever I'm doing. Like I've had this awareness that I'll never likely be the best at many things, but that doesn't sort of take any enjoyment out of me doing my best at them. So my current role, I have less day-to-day engineering. I don't get to dig into the code as much as perhaps I want to or would like to, but then that's not what my role entails. Although it's fun to dig into the code and try and find like trending habits amongst our engineers to see, if there's anything we can learn from. Is there something we're all doing that we could be avoiding? Is there something we could try and improve on, that sort of thing, and looking at that. And then looking at, like what's coming up in C++20 and things with ranges and stuff, and could we use that to maybe search through our database of players a little bit better and adopting those things into our code base. And then also look at like individual requirements. If someone wants to, we have pathways from QA into engineering within SI. If someone wants to move from QA into engineering, how do we facilitate that? What courses can I point them towards, etc., to sort of get them up to speed? That type of thing as well. But yeah, I think keep learning is the key thing, and software engineering keeps changing. There's new engines and languages and techniques to pick up. Inheritance was like when I started, everything was like a deep inheritance change, deep hierarchies, and that was like the only way to do things. And if you work on some old engines, you'll still see this in there. But then, composition came along maybe like 10 years ago and started getting a lot of traction, which is like, oh, wow, this is a new way of doing things. So, I still know people that haven't adapted to use composition. They still prefer inheritance. And, if it works for what they're doing, it works. But I always like to try and see, is there a better way? Let's pick this stuff up. So I know at least know enough about it now to know if I should use it or I shouldn't be using it. And it's really fine not to know. If you've got the right tools, to facilitate your learning, you'll know it soon enough. Like with enough time and repetition, I can probably build expertise in an area of engineering. That might cause an area that I'm using in the past to stagnate a little bit as well. Like as I try to keep hold of immediate knowledge. And the other thing is with languages changing, things might change. There might become a better way of doing something. If I'm not actively looking at that, then yeah, that'll transfer from maybe a depth of knowledge in that area to just a breadth of knowledge in that area. The other things like working 9 to 5 as a software engineer is really different than studying engineering. Um, Studying is like this aspect of, acquiring new knowledge. Um, that's the whole course is you're acquiring new knowledge. But like working 9 times out of 10 is just application of something you've seen before or something you've done. Um, it's just using the sort of right tools. One thing I always think is like, having the right attitude is a tool as well. And always being open to, you know, software engineering is not a job where you can just go, right, I've learned everything. I'm going to sit back and do this and that's it. I don't know many jobs that are. It's constantly like, okay, cool. I know enough to do this now, but there's so much more I need to learn to either do this other thing or do this better. Um, there's a number of times I've looked back at code that I've written and realized like, oh, I could have done that a different way. And I occasionally go back and try and do it a different way. Um, for my own personal stuff, I really like, I do a lot of Game Boy programming and things like that in my spare time. And I find that works really well for trying to get me to do the sort of most efficient way of getting something done. Because again, a Game Boy doesn't really have any memory. It's not a very fast processor either. So you sort of have to do things and you get good at having to do them a certain way. So it's a kind of fun way of improving my understanding of like very sort of basic, rudimentary code. Yeah. But yeah, any questions? I sort of struggled to figure out where to end this one.
That was awesome, and it's nice to sort of see just your progression as well. I really love the fact that you left sort of industry into education and come back, and your view on teaching and developing people as well. Um, and just to that point, one of the questions here is do you see a difference in your more junior developers and engineers compared to your more senior ones in how they develop their skill sets and retain knowledge, and what does that journey look like, or do people still, is it a personality type that will go to, like you say, textbooks every time, or as you become more senior and tenured, do you pick up new skills in different ways?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I know, like I was surprised just in a meeting yesterday, and someone mentioned the Coding Train, which is a YouTube channel that I love because that guy's the world's happiest programmer. Which if you haven't checked it out, check it out. His content is great. But it was a senior dev that mentioned it, which took me by surprise because I was kind of like, I'd expect younger, more junior developers perhaps to have more of a handle on like, current YouTube, um, you know, uh, tutorial content and things like that. And that's typically like, yeah, I know a number of, students that, use Brackeys or the equivalent and things like that, and other YouTube devs, and the older guys or more senior guys, I should say, um, tend to resort more to using, available SDKs and reading SDKs like that. Um, so we've got some old devs that are switching over to Unity from C++, and just pointing them into, here's the Unity documentation, here's the SDK. They're quite happy to go ahead and read that because that's how they learned how to do anything. There was no YouTube channel for how to write, PlayStation 3 code or PlayStation 2 code. It was like, here's the SDK, and go away and read that. So I guess there's a bit of that, but I think over time it changes from sort of as junior engineers maybe pick up good habits from their more senior engineers, where it's the case of, seniors will frequently be like, oh, go and read the SDK on that, and send them a link, and you get used to reading it, going like, oh, it's all spelled out here for me. I can, have a play with this and adapt it. So yeah, I see more of like, a lot of junior engineers coming in are used to these video courses, Udemy, Coursera, that style of thing, and maybe they're not as familiar with using SDKs as much, and that's something they pick up from the more senior engineers. Likewise, I guess a bit of the YouTube stuff rubs off on the more senior engineers because, someone pointed out the Coding Train, which made me kind of happy.
Awesome. Thank you for that. What trends are you currently seeing in terms of retaining developers? In my previous field, it was like a revolving door, and the hiring process was constant.
Um, I this is a tricky one, I guess, for Sports Interactive, where our attention's really good. And talking with other, game studios across the sector, our attention is really good compared with some of them. We've had, blips here and there, where people leave, people move on, etc. To, things change. But I think there's a lot of our devs internally have a lot of love for our product. Um, there's a lot of FM fans that make FM, or football fans that make FM and go into it. It's an interesting product to work on again because of, where it touches, you know, the real world simulating football manager and that sort of weird circle of life that's going on there. But um, yeah, I think we've got a lot of product knowledge. Also, I think that the way we are set up internally as a studio is quite welcoming. So my onboarding process for junior engineers, um, I sort of don't expect a junior engineer coming in or a graduate from university to really be a productive member of the engineering team until about 4 months in to their role. That first 4 months is them sort of learning the ropes. We do like we've got like an induction onboarding exercise they go through to get up to speed with things like Perforce, because I mean most universities use Git because Perforce is more expensive, and I understand that, and Git's everywhere. And they're like, this is vanilla ice cream, this is vanilla ice cream. They're the same type of thing. Um, but yeah, we go through that, working with teams, just, code reviews, things that, don't happen in universities and sort of education. No one goes through a code review. So we go through that, onboarding them, then giving them some problems to work with a day-to-day mentor. So they're just getting used to those type of things. And yeah, we don't really have any expectation on them to be like, we don't expect you to day one be productive. It's going to take some time. Um,
It's a terminology that we use for people coming out of the boot camp is we'd say our students are ready to work, moving into ready to contribute. People are
yeah,
ready to work, they're ready to commit themselves to go and do something, but they maybe not ready to contribute to, solving a specific problem, which is actually quite interesting there comparative to what you're saying, Jamie, when you were talking about your first role, where it's like there was no onboarding, and
no,
yet you were like dive straight into, by the way, can you build this mini game? Is that something that you were passionate about putting in place because you felt it was needed, or do you think that that's how ultimately, and it must be the way you think, it's like that's how we get the most out of people long term, right?
yeah, it's growing up that way. I'd love to say like, oh, it's all my work, but it's not. There's an onboarding process and a mentoring process in place at Sports Interactive before I got here. And there's lots of them at different companies. I think, as people like myself who have come through of being sort of thrown to the lions, and then they've seen that and they're like, I don't want anybody else to go through that. Let's try and set this up properly. Let's have, and I think as companies get older and our tech gets older, we have to get better at training people up on the things that we do internally, because like, yes, we're switching to Unity, and Unity's, a public available game engine that anyone can use and get experience in. There are other companies like Ubisoft out there who use, what is it, Anvil and Snowdrop, internally, which you can't just sign up to Coursera and do a course on. You can't YouTube how do I do this in Anvil, etc. You need to have that very specific introduction to it. So they have their own sort of course map, as it were, for when you join in. So yeah, I think it's something that's built up over time as people have realized like that's not the best way to get the most out of engineers,
Right.
or you start seeing people burn out too soon just from just sheer stress of working.
Yeah, and that actually does link into, but in the games industry, there's the constant horror stories of the term the crunch. Um, and funny enough, actually, I can't say it on a YouTube. I can't say it on a YouTube stream, but I'll talk to you about a friend of mine that's just been on a crunch, and it's like it's a real thing that I do see in the games industry. But what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think that that's pushing people away from the industry? Do you think it's something we're getting better at?
I think I'd like to say it's something we're getting better at. The more we talk about it, the more aware of it being a bad practice it is, and the further it can go up the chain to higher up somewhere that can do something about it. I can say that, at Sports Interactive, we're an annually released title, so there are pressures that come along with that of getting things done by a release date. Although, year on year, we've improved so that, and I think the only recent time that people have talked about crunch in the studio was for, I think it was FM 21, and that was worked on during COVID and lockdown periods. And some of that was fed into it because no one really knew what was going to happen with football that year. Like, was it going to
Right.
go ahead? Were they going to play it? Or how was and that was, there was discussions around that of like, do we just pretend that it never happened? Or do we try and simulate this into a
Oh, yeah, of
season?
course.
Um, so that's, yeah. Sometimes working on a real world game can have uh, interesting things that come back. Like we've had to adapt to like the Russia-Ukraine war that changed a lot of international football rules for Russia and Ukraine. And other things like there was the earthquake in Turkey recently that sort of impacted upon us because that affected a lot of Turkish football clubs, and that's a league that we simulate as well. Um, and yes, that can sometimes sort of bleed into like developer time. But we're set up quite well internally, and there's not a lot of crunch, if any, that really goes on. I don't think we call it crunch. No one's called it that this year at all. Everything's run really smoothly. But I know there's other studios. I've got mates in the industry that experience it as a sort of thing of like when a project's coming up for release, we'll crunch desperately to get it sort of done, and
Yep.
it's horrific. But when I was teaching, I always used to laugh at this because it used to be the students that would leave their assignment to the very last minute would be the ones that would ask me about crunch. And it's kind of like you're feeding into this habit of not doing work until the last minute, and then
Right.
you're also telling me that crunch is bad. Um, and as an industry, we're getting better with planning. We have proper producers and people that look at that project management side of things and scale things out. And when I worked at 2K, we had a producer. I don't quite know what they did, but they he could make a good coffee, but he didn't sort of manage a lot of stuff as I saw it as a junior.
Oh, which
Um,
making coffee is technically producing something.
Yeah, which is a bit of an oxymoron as well, right? But yeah, as an industry, I'd say the games industry is growing up a lot. And for me, when I left it in like 2012 to go teach, maybe it was 2000, yeah, it's 2012, 13 to go and teach, and then sort of it was or 11. Oh, it doesn't matter. Anyway, to move into education and then to come back and see how much it's changed is quite refreshing. You still hear some of the horror stories here and there, but less so at some of the larger firms that were perhaps more guilty of it in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for that. There's a couple of questions about transitioning in companies such as
Mhm.
yourselves, but it's how many software development developers at Sports Interactive have transitioned their careers into the field of data science, sports science, AI at real world football clubs? Do you see that transition happening?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. We had one of our researchers left recently to go work with a football club as one of their
Right.
data scientists. I think that was
Wow.
last year. So that does happen. We had another engineer. Um, trying to think, that was, yeah, it was before Christmas, so it was last year. One of our other engineers left to move from like working at Sports Interactive in games to working for I can't remember the name of the company now, but they're like a data analysis company in football. So
Right.
you know they are partnered with a few different football clubs. Um, I think Valencia was one of them as well. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. So we do have people that move out and into that side of things that suddenly go like, oh, actually I've got a real love and passion for this data side of it instead of maybe the game side of it. Um, but yeah, it's not too many, I'd say. There's some that come in the other way. There's some that have been researchers, etc., at football clubs but want to get
Wow.
into games, etc., and come into SI for that.
Incredible. And I guess linked to that as well, is it common to see people that work within a games company but not in the software side, customer service, sales, marketing, who know the company inside out, and then go into that? Do companies support in doing that? Is that a good career path, or do you generally see people coming in sort of sideways into an organisation straight into those roles?
Um, we've had a few pathways. I think one of our senior producers on the art team, his pathway was pretty interesting because he came in through comms and marketing and that side of stuff and licensing, and moved across. And I think previously he'd worked in sort of like a hospitality industry outside of SI. Um, but I think he'd had some relevant qualification in like a business degree from somewhere, but was working in hospitality when he moved in. But yeah, there's some sideways movement. One of the things that I've looked at internally for us is, occasionally we get someone in QA that might want to move across to a different pathway.
It's like you've just read the chat. Someone's
Yeah.
just put, "How do I go from QA into software dev?" Does that happen?
It does, yeah. We've got a sort of internal pathway for that. Looking at that, going, all right. So you want to get into software? Well, the first port of call is having a chat with me, and sort of gauging what are you currently doing, where are your interests at, sort of thing. What have you done in the past? Talking about that, and then seeing if there's any material we could sort of give you to assist you in that sort of progression. So giving you things to look at, or setting a couple of tasks here or there, like, hey, do you want to try and make some sort of game in Unity, etc., or even um, you know a small scene in Unity or something like that, and going over that with them, and implement this, implement that, having a chat about that, and then eventually at some point they'd have to take a coding test to go through that sort of thing. But as they're internal to us already, they get a sort of a good guidance into how that can be done, and areas they need to improve on as well, which is quite fun.
It's we say to our Unity grads, going into QA and testing is it gets you in the door. And in fact, we had one of the
Yep.
Zach from Google yesterday. He said is get yourself as physically close to the organization you want to be in tomorrow,
Mm.
today. So it's like if you're working with a supplier to somewhere you want to work, or if you're working in QA, or just get in because, as you say,
Yep.
that you understand the culture in the organization, and then you can have those. Someone can email you internally, right, and say this is what I want to do, and you can have that chat. So I think that's
Yeah.
awesome to hear from an organization as well that you're open to that because, and hopefully other organizations are too.
Yeah, no, it's nice. Sometimes it's usually the line managers or producers that have put me in touch with the QA team members that they've got that are like, oh, hey, they've talked about wanting to get into coding, so we're going to introduce them to you. So I just get up all in their face about what do you want to code, um, and it's usually good fun. It's a good laugh.
Awesome. Well, I think that's sort of we've got some other questions coming through. But what I'll do is I'll send. Are you okay for me to send any further ones that come through
Yep, totally fine.
over? And I think really just to recap on my side, there was what the last question for me really was um, through through your career, you kept learning and kept trying. And I
Mhm.
think that was the thing for me. It was like did you ever have a pathway in your mind of where you were going to go, or was it just opportunistic? Something came up and that meant you had to pick up this new technology, or did you really have a defined route? How did that work for you? Because
Yeah, I never really had a plan. Like I never had a 5-year plan for that sort of stuff. Like I set goals internally, but I think I was chatting about this a lot of the time. I think I was very perhaps product focused. I'd be working on a game and I'd learn stuff around what would make the game better or what would my role be. Particularly more as an indie. So like working for 2K and Technics again, small cog in a bigger machine. Be implementing mini games, etc., and things like that, or mission scripting, or implementing something on the back end. That would be I would learn the material to do what I needed to do for that product. But then when I went indie, a lot of my learning was more focused around like people had come in or pitched us an app idea or a game idea, or a game we were working on internally. Um, and everything I learned would be to make that the best product possible, but I never had a plan for like, oh, I'm going to go to senior engineer to lead to do this. It all sort of, I just naturally went that way. Um, like, we started out as a two-man sort of indie venture, and I think by the end of it, by the time I left, there was 9 or 10 of us in the office. And I'd sort of taken on the duties of being the lead engineer, probably because, I liaised with clients the most, but also I'd organize and talk with the rest of the team as well and had that sort of natural sort of, what's the word, kin for engaging with people and people management. Whereas, some of the guys that I work with who are great engineers didn't want to take up that responsibility and were quite happy with, I just want to be an engineer type of thing. Um, so no, none of it was planned. It's all just sort of like a one happy accident that I've done a lot of work on to get here. I never, developer advocate was a role I didn't even realize existed until Sports Interactive started asking me about it. Um, I was like, oh, okay, that actually sounds really interesting. I think I should do that. And I got approval off my wife that she said I could do it. And that,
And the rest is
yeah,
history. Awesome.
yeah. Maybe she's the one with the plan.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's why you don't need to have one. There you go. Thank you ever so much for your time today. That really, really is appreciated and just really interesting to hear. Like you say, is there doesn't necessarily have to be a plan going through, and also you don't have to know everything. A compiler will tell you that it's wrong, as you said earlier, or
Yeah,
you can find out whilst you're doing it, but getting yourself in a position to try it and understand that failing is part of trying as well, right? It's
yeah.
like that's going to happen naturally, is super important. So
Well,
thank you
yeah. I
once
mean,
again.
I've done that with us. Just to cap on that. I noticed something in our engine that we weren't doing. Um, and I thought, oh, I'll bring that up because that's something we could do. Only to find out that it had not been documented anywhere, but someone had already looked at that and decided that it was a bad idea, sort of thing. So, here was me coming and waving this flag of like, hey, I've got this great idea that we could do. And then someone's just raining on my parade with, no, we looked at that, but we didn't document it. So, you know, oh well.
It happens. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. I really do
Cheers.
appreciate that. And yeah, thank you everyone for Careers Week and see you all again soon. Bye
Cool.
now.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye.